And maybe our lived experiences are different in the sense that my lived experience is highly politicized. Every day of my life, that's what it is. As a young black woman in South Africa, it's politicized. As a young black poor woman living from the township in South Africa, it's even worse, right? And it's not like, I'm not gauging levels here. So it becomes important for me to understand that as a black person in the world, you're already a political. You understand? So it becomes, and because I'm saying this, because I'll refer back to, in your story, you speak about religion and Christianity and how it has stripped us from our own spiritual practices, right? That was a highly political move. You understand? Yes, you didn't write with the intention of being political, but I will pick it up as political. So that's why I said it is important to look with that scope, that personal scope, but it is very hard for you to intentionally separate when your entire existence is political, to separate that. I don't know how you can do that genuinely. I don't know.
Nice. So, okay. So from all you've said, there is a need to write about various things, write about the times, write about the past. So considering the fact that you all write across genres, so I just want to know, how do you compartmentalize? Like, how do you define a story? Like, how do you define the genre that the story you want to write should take on? So because I read Valley of Memories, and when I was reading it, I didn't read it as a Frances story. So in my head, it could have been a piece of fiction. And so I just want to, why did you write Valley of Memories as an essay? Why not as a short story? I mean, say with Sibongile and our piece of violent punctuations in the self. So like, how do you decide on, for our, let's say, how do you know this shouldn't be a poem, this should be an essay, or this should be a short story? How do you guys, because I think of stories as essays in my head, so I just want to know how.
Okay, thank you very much. Most of the time, I'll give you an example. A child was kidnapped near where I was living. The parents, they were just this evening roadside stalls, the woman's fries, potatoes and akara balls and all that. So the children were playing there, and then two young men come to buy akara and plantain, and then they join the children in playing ball, and then they scoop one and disappear into the night. The evening was still young. So when I heard that, then I came out the next morning and I saw the woman at the road. This help Nigerians offer that is not really useful. So what was the boy wearing? So at what time did this happen? Those questions are actually useless because they don't help. But I saw the woman's desperation to supply the answers, because she felt that maybe there's a narrow chance that if I tell this person what my child was wearing, my child will come out. So that's why sometimes we linger around when we lose things. Like if your phone was stolen now and people ask you useless questions, so where did you put it? You feel the pressure to say, it was in this bag. It's useless. They won't help. But because you're feeling that there's a chance, so yeah, that's that. So when I wrote that story, I wrote it as fiction. And then when I wrote Valley of Memories, I wrote it as nonfiction. And then your question, yeah, it's, I think when stories come as fiction to me, most of the time, the stories that come as fiction to me are stories that didn't happen directly to me. Sorry, yes, so I can add my bits because I don't have all the details and the materials. Now, stories that happened personally to me, I have the material from the beginning to the end, so I can comfortably narrate the entire event or the entire scenes in my own language, picturing my experience as clear as possible. But I don't have that favor, or I don't have that privilege with another person's story. Hawaliman's story, if I want to write it, I won't write it as an essay. I don't know her, but I can just fictionalize Boko Haram kidnapping someone and killing the person. So that's how I know stories that are essays and stories that are fiction. Yeah.
For me, it's usually either an essay or a poem, although I do a bit of fiction. I love poetry, but sometimes it has its limitations. There are some things you want to say, and you just know a poem won't cut it, right? Because you have to be as brief as possible. They talk about the economy of words. You have to just be punchy and all of that. But with essays, I don't have to take all of that into consideration, right? With nonfiction, I just write everything I want to write. I write it the way it comes to me. There is no pressure to write metaphors or imagery or all of that. It's just me pouring out everything that is inside my head. So to an extent, I think doing nonfiction is a bit easier because like I'm not really constrained by technicalities or all of that, and I can write as full as I want, as completely as I want, without having to wonder, am I sounding too prosaic, am I being too explanatory? All of these things are problems that I do not have to deal with when I'm writing nonfiction. So it always comes down to one question: which medium is going to express what I have in my head more clearly, right? If I wanted to do a poem, I would say, I want to be able to talk about this, I want to be able to talk about that. But with essays, I can just write everything I want to write about. Sometimes I start writing poetry, and then I realize, it's not cutting it. This has to be an essay. Like my story on Popular, it started as after I experienced it, I was narrating it to someone on the phone, and he was like, wow, why don't you write about that? That sounds pretty good. And I'm like, oh, okay. And I started writing a poem about it, but it wasn't really cutting it. There were so many moments in the journey that I wanted to transcribe into writing, but poetry was not really creating an avenue for that. So I said, okay, let me try nonfiction. And I wrote it, and it was flowing, and I was like, yeah, this is it. So it all comes down to how much of myself I am able to express when I'm writing it, which medium gives me the more opportunity than the other.
You want to speak to this?
I will, because I have the mic, but I agree fully with how it's really about like what I have to say and which medium will clearly express it. But also when I sit down, personally, I know what I'm going to write, right? So I know that this, and then it goes back to the fluidity we're speaking about, which is what you're also saying. So yeah, I know. Let me stop talking. Just ask the next question.
Okay. So Frances said something about how our memory sometimes are inaccurate. So in Tell It Slant by Brenda Miller and Suzanne Paola, there was something they said, I'll just read. They said, memory itself can be called its own bit of creative nonfiction. We continually, often unconsciously renovate our memories, shaping them into stories that bring coherence to chaos. So my question is, this art of fabrication, this style of sometimes using our imaginations to fill up spaces, especially for those that write personal essays, like, is it something you've had to do often? And if you do it, does it sort of in any way invalidate the truth of the essay?
Okay, I'm actually very new to creative nonfiction. The Valley of Memories is my second a long piece of nonfiction I've done. The first one was, maybe a third. The first one was Thursday's Children. That was curated by Adams Adeosuya. So it was actually Adams who encouraged me to go into nonfiction. I'd never written it. And when I read The Miseducation of Gratitude, I was wondering how these people do these things. And I only know about fiction and fabricating and all that. I never really knew what to do with my realities and how to put it into essays. So when I read her piece and all that, it stayed with me for a very long time. And I was wondering how she was able to do that. So, yeah, you want to thank me?
Yeah, no, I wanted to just get a sense. Maybe I'm misunderstanding this. I don't think when you write creative nonfiction, you fictionalize nonfiction. So I want to clarify that. You just creatively express nonfiction. So nothing in creative nonfiction is fiction. You just maybe borrow the style, but it's still the green drapes It's still, you just borrow the style of writing, but it's not necessarily fiction. It's still true. Everything that happened is still true. Everything that happened to you in your story is still true. Everything that happened is still true. However, you express it in a creative way. So I don't want, because I think that then goes back to your earlier question of why people think it's not enough. I think there's that like miseducation. There's that like misunderstanding or like confusion around what creative nonfiction is. And creative nonfiction has always existed. You know, it's only that now young people who we are facing so many nuanced oppressions that violence is violence, but not all violence is physical, you know, and not all violence, it can be seen, but some violences are subtle, you know, and we don't know how to express that. And then you realize that I can creatively do this so that the reader can be invited in the same way a fiction writer invites a reader in, but at the end, after walking the reader through, the reader realizes that this is an actual event that took place. So I don't know.
I wasn't saying you fictionalize nonfiction, but sometimes in nonfiction essays, it's up to the writer to come to us and say, all of it was real. I mean, if I say all of it, if some of it was not real, you wouldn't even know, right? So it's the writer who actually gives us that attestation that this thing I produced, all of it was real. In some, there may be non-fiction stories where maybe all of it were real, but there may be bits and pieces of it a writer may want to adjust a little bit to fit into the narration.
Then it's no longer non-fiction. Then it falls into a different genre.
No, but we call it non-fiction, right? It's produced as non-fiction. Yeah, I'm saying exactly. it's when you're interacting with the writer, like we are doing now, that the writer comes out and says, all of it was non-fiction. There may be essays that maybe bits of it are non-fiction, but we won't even know. We're calling it non-fiction. That's where what he's saying falls into. I don't know if you understand what I'm saying.
No, I hear you, but I'm worried that then we're not being honest with the genre we're falling into. Yeah. So that's my worry as writers. Okay. Then we're not being honest.
Yeah, that's where he mentioned trusting your memory, like people who narrate from their childhood. How sure are we that these things that happened at 7, 8, 9 were actually real? Were actually completely real to a 60-year-old man? How much does he remember? How much do we really remember about our past when we're writing our memoir? That's where his questions is for. I don't know if you understand.
No, I hear you.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, I'm saying this on the fact that because in 1988, Swiss writer and journalist Daniel Gansfield reviewed that Benjamin Wilkominski's memoir, Fragments, Memories of a Wartime Childhood, detailing his experience as a child soldier, contained factual inaccuracies. And somehow that invalidated all that the book stood for, even though it was a very brilliant memoir. So that's why I'm thinking, like, if in those cases where we have to fill in the gaps because we do not remember exactly what happened, does that invalidate the entire truth that the essay contains?
I'm more worried about genre specifics. So if we're saying this is creative non-fiction, then why are we allowing for fictional experiences to be, I mean, I advocate for fluidity, but I just want to understand then what genre then does it become? Because then maybe language then limits us in that sense. So maybe.
I mean, I think there was a coinage called faction or something. Yeah.
Okay, I haven't really been in a situation where I've had to fictionalize in order to fill up a gap when I'm writing a creative nonfiction. So I'm not sure I'm really able to talk about that. But I would say I feel like everything is nonfiction. You're writing fiction, it's not your nonfiction, but it might be someone else's nonfiction, right? So perhaps it's not your story, but you're writing about someone else's story. I'm sure almost all of the writers here have written about maybe fiction, and then a random person on the internet sends you an email or sees you in person and they're like, oh my God, I saw myself in that thing you wrote. It was so accurate. Like I was reading a nonfiction Hassana wrote, she showed me yesterday. It's not published, so I had the privilege of seeing it. And she was writing about her aunt who had died, and I saw my aunt who had died, and I said, Hassana, it's like I wrote this, right? Like, this was exactly what happened to me, right? Now, if she had said that was fiction, it would still be my reality. It would still be non-fiction. So I don't know, but like, people feel like fiction is stranger than non-fiction. I feel like non-fiction is way stranger than fiction. Like, the things that happen in reality, the human mind cannot completely imagine or comprehend it. Yeah, so if in a situation where you have to invent to fill up spaces, I don't feel like it should be called fictionalizing. I feel like you're just borrowing someone else's experiences and using them to fill up the space up. Well, maybe because I'm a law student, so I'm trying to
be diplomatic.
But I don't really like that it's called fictionalizing.
No, but it is, because it's not your true experience. I don't understand why this is like so wishy-washy.
No, they are true experiences.
Like, of
they're
who?
just not yours.
Yeah.
Else's.
So okay. So you're saying you're writing creative nonfiction, but it's not your experience. So you're not presenting the story as yours. Okay. In that sense, I agree. But the minute you present the story as yours, as a narrator, and then now in your narration you filling up stuff, why don't you then just call it short fiction?
Because it's not short fiction.
But you can write.
I'm genuinely confused.
But you can use the first. You can write an essay using the first person, but the story is entirely another person's story.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. You
Oh
can
no, of course. Like when we get into tonals and all of those things. Yeah, that.
Well, I said at the beginning that I haven't really had to do that before, so.
Because if it's an actual event, it's valid. If you're borrowing an actual event, that I understand.
Yeah,
but
the
if it's a
problem is
fictional event, yes, it can be true to someone else. But if it's fictional to you, the writer, then it's fiction. I don't
feel
know.
like if it's fictional to you, but someone else's experience, we can call it non-fiction. We just can't say it's my non-fiction.
That's back to what she said. Okay, so Sibongile, you mentioned something about when you were talking about your realities in South Africa as a black woman, and how somehow you need to write the essays in such a way that the reader feels the pulse of the moment, because it's like recording the times. So here is my question, based on back to our conversation about writing to reflect the moment and writing about documenting contemporary history. You get so. Because right now is a point that I think that more than ever before, many millennials are battling the existential crisis, body positivity issues, and so I'm thinking, and this is the time where we have a spike in young writers doing creative nonfiction. So what I'm thinking in my head is, because literature borrows from reality, right now we have so much materials to draw from to write essays. So here is my question. What if, say, there's a projection that the Earth will crash in 17 months, which looks really cool,
I know, right?
Yeah,
burn everything.
So here's my question. What if somehow it doesn't happen, and then we're here for
argument that we're going to have? Because it sounds like it. Okay, can I just answer? I don't like that argument. I think it's very disrespectful for people who are still dealing with their trauma, for someone else to come out and say, oh, well, that's trauma porn or whatever they say. I don't know what they say. I'm not responsible for the reader. And I'm not going to take that onus on myself to be responsible for the reader. I write. I'm responsible to the story. And yes, I will care for the reader when I do my second, third drafts or whatever. And then I'll care for the reader to exercise my control, my power of control. How do I then walk the reader through without triggering them or whatever the case may be? But I'm not responsible for the reader. I can't take that upon myself. So I will write about my trauma. You don't have to read it. You don't have to read it. I'm not going to even engage in that argument of like trauma, because there's so much trauma, and it's that what we in the previous, it's still silencing. It's just now in the literature, in a literature context, but it's still silencing, because now you're silencing me as writing creative nonfiction to say, oh well, you're writing too much trauma. And this happened recently. There's a book recently that came out called Black Tax, and I'm published in the book. And I struggled with that essay. And when you read that essay, you will see that there are things missing in that essay because of that silencing. Because I'm expressing much traumatic things. So I economize and I cut out some of things that are important. And what we don't realize is that usually the people who come up with those arguments aren't really truthfully reading your work. But someone else, you expressing your trauma, someone else will recognize themselves in that. And coming from a history where we're not represented and where our history is really documented and archived, I don't subscribe to that, sorry.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I feel like if you write about your trauma, about your truth, your experiences, and someone else says, oh, that's trauma writing, that's fine, that's your problem. I'm sure the person I wrote it for would read it and find themselves in it. So if you feel like what I've written is trauma writing, I wasn't writing to you, I was
Still die, right?
Yeah,
So yeah, so there would always be, my second essay in the Writivism long list for 2017 was about the death of my dad. I mean, it took me so long. He died in 2007, and I was writing about him 10 years later because I've been struggling with the language and the material. It's been there, but I was not able to express it. So even when the world starts working well, there would always be personal experiences. There would always be experiences of other people. Now about encourage me to say it or pour it out there. It doesn't matter. So I struggled with my family who would read it. I struggled with people who would read it. In fact, my first crime scene was my family because I knew my sisters were going to say, why did she put it out there? So yeah, I think we should be able to express ourselves.
Right. Okay, so I think we were running out of time. So before we throw it to the audience, I just want to ask some. So recently, my essay was recently published in the latest issue of Anathema magazine, and I found that, I mean, it was a personal essay, and I found out that it was the only piece for the non-fiction category. And then I discovered that most of the speculative fiction journals do not have personal essays. So I'm thinking, what are the publishing prospects for non-fiction writers in a futuristic Africa?
First, I just want to say that essay of yours was brilliant. I still talk about it with my friends. That was just brilliant.
Sorry, was it the one about dying?
Yeah. There's quite a lot of pressure on non-fiction writers that we don't really talk about.
So sorry, I think it's just like a minute. Let's just
Okay. When you write personal essays, some magazines would say it's not personal enough. And I'm like, what else do you want me to do? I'm literally standing in this essay, like I'm just being honest, like I'm naked in this essay, but what else do you want, right? So I think sometimes they want a performative vulnerability, and that's not being honest, right? Like, if you're being performative, your reader will know. Your reader is not stupid, right? And then it defeats the whole essence of what you're writing. And then sometimes you write critical essays and they say it's not critical enough. Like, I have this essay I had written and I had sent it to so many places. They would all reject it, but they would add comments about me considering being more... in essence, they were trying to change my narrative, but this is my story, and I know it's better than you do or better than anyone else would. But you're trying to tell me to maybe add this or remove this, but these are not my experiences. If I do that, I'm not being true to myself. I'm not being true to my art. And perhaps it is marketable for you, but it's insulting to my reader. So yeah.
All right. So, okay. Okay, Natalia, I don't know, can we pass the mic around?
I never thought you guys would come to us. We were starting to feel a bit left out, neglected. But the conversation, I'm glad that these conversations are happening, especially for you as young writers to be able to have these kinds of conversations. So congratulations on that. Something that Francis mentioned earlier on, I don't remember, you were saying something about the writing might be cliche if you made an example about the Chibok girls. I'm paraphrasing now, but it made me think about how, as Africans, all of us, we tend to neglect the importance of our stories.
Yep.
So 1 or 2 or 10 or 20 writers have written about the Chibok girls. Now I can't write about it because whether it's fiction or nonfiction, because it's so much. And I don't like making this example, but I do. How the Jewish writers make the... I was facilitating yet another, right? Just a few days ago, before I came here. It's another book about the story of the Holocaust. She's writing 3 generations or 4 or 5 generations later on, and the story is beautiful. So I think we need to give that to ourselves. There can never be enough books or too many books on Chibok girls, on Winnie Mandela, on Amata Aidu, on Jane Cortez, on any of us. So we need to, and don't let, some readers are going to trash your work, that's their role. Some readers are going to interrogate your work and critique it. Some readers are going to find their own voice in that story and write their own. So please, let's do that. So that was that. And something else that Sibongile mentioned that I completely forgot. But thank you so much. Thank you so much for the work that you are doing. Oh, yes, I remember. It's not the Sibongile piece, but you're talking about all of these things, and this applies to all the other panelists as well. Send the people to the bookstore to buy your damn books. You know, remind them, because some of these people just sit here and then they leave. Yes.
Go buy the books, guys. All the books from the previous panel.
Please, we'll take her.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this panel. So my question is on that earlier argument that was going on in terms of writing about the times. And I want to relate it to activism and how virtually anything going on in Nigeria now, especially when it has to do with women and girls, I get a message to say that, Buki, why are you not saying anything about this? Or you know, why are you not marching about this? You know, so why did you march about Church Me Too? Why did you march? Why are you not? And then you get all of this when the very irresponsible slapping senator, when that issue happened, I was still like dealing with Church Me Too and the whole intricacies coming with it. And then I was getting videos, Buki, you must do something. So I want to find a balance between these two arguments. The argument of don't choose for me what battles I should take on. At the same time, the aspect of the power of your voice and control that you have, that you know, okay, if I lend my voice to this or if I do something, it was like this last issue that happened, is the xenophobia issue, and I was getting a lot of messages that, Buki, you need to organize the same kind of protest that you did to Koza Church and do it for this one too. And I was off social media. I've been off social media because I needed to take a break, yet this pressure is coming. How do you find that balance between knowing that you can say something, how far it will go, you don't know, and the fact that, can I choose my battles? And I'm relating it to the writings that you talked about. Thank you.
Can I just, because it's something I'm really, really like very passionate about. It might be my personal bias to say that it is your responsibility as a writer to reflect the times, and I'm not saying it's not flawed. It might be flawed. So when we say reflect the times, you're not saying reflect the times right now. That's not what we're saying. I'm not saying write about the times right now. So I'm not saying write about what's happening right now. I'm saying reflect the times. The times could be 30 years ago. The times can be the projected future. It can be whatever. I'm just saying that coming from like a history where there is not enough documentation and not enough archiving, we can use this beautiful thing that fiction and creative nonfiction does, which is touch the lives and the hearts of people to kind of like also service the world in that way. So it's very difficult because it is an existential crisis that we go through, where you are existing in a world and then you also have that I as a writer, the observer. How do you negotiate that? I don't have an answer how to do that. I personally, I'm going through the same thing. I had to be off social media because it's not just Afrophobia, it's also femicide, and I'm getting into a white space where I work and everyone is just like, why aren't you wearing black? Why aren't you in mourning and in solidarity with us? You know, because I'm a black woman, I'm meant to be in solidarity. And it's like, do you know how traumatic is that? Why aren't you at a march? Do you know how triggering it is to be at a march? Have you ever been at a march? Do you know how triggering it is? Can you respect that you don't know my history, and that you don't know my history? Because you don't know my history, you don't know why I made the choice that I made. So I agree. And when I say reflect the times, I'm not taking away the agency from writers to say write about whatever you write. I'm just saying let's stop having this warped sense of existence where we think we exist in a different world from the world that we actually live in our daily lives.
Yeah. Tosin. TJ Bensi, rather.
Okay, hello everyone. I just feel in nonfiction, when we have to resort to lying in nonfiction writing, I think, I'm sorry. Okay, I think it's an act of laziness, and also it means we are not considering our realities as important enough to write about. I think we are looking for, when we're writing nonfiction, we're looking for sort of beautiful stories, or there's an expectation of what we think is publishable or writable. But when it's creative writing, I think it has a lot to do with your perspective or your way of seeing things, and that is what should be shaped, because we have read widely, people have written about butterflies, people have written about all kinds of things, and it's so beautiful, and it touches us, and it can even be political. A kiss is political, which is touching on the other aspect of it also. So I think it comes to us, it's the responsibility of us to read more and see how we can shape, so that whatever is ordinary, I've read all your work, and all I see is truth when I see your work. But if you read something, if you read a non-fiction piece that has lies in it, I think you can, to a degree, yeah, a seasoned reader would tell. The other aspect, what I want to ask is, how do you ensure, let's say, safety when you share things? You talk about having to deal with family and all that, and also navigate shame. We were all in that wonderful collection together where we were all bearing. I don't know whether we thought we were going to be published, but it was put in the world there. So I wanted to ask, okay, from your experience, have you received any backlash? And how do you navigate shame, safety, and all that, since we are still in Nigeria, and Nigerians read our books?
You guys want to answer that?
Okay, about, I wasn't in the collection, but about the Valley of Memories, when my family read it, they told me, it was my mom, first of all, who called me and said, come, so you have been going to Dibia and you did not tell me, and all of that, because of the religious affiliation. And then my sisters, everybody, they liked I think it was probably the attention the story got sort of neutralized their reactions. So, out of the whole Africa, because yeah, they know how to, out of the whole Africa, you made top 3. So the subject of the story wasn't really a problem anymore. It wasn't like a random story they saw out there, but I know if it wasn't presented on the platform where it was, it would have been a huge problem. Yeah.
Farida.
Okay, so the conversation about fiction, non-fiction. I used to write fiction, and then now I write non-fiction. And most of the conversations about non-fiction sound like fiction. So when I'm reading fiction or non-fiction, how do I know? Is it based on the first person pronoun? And then I feel like there isn't a lot of attention given to non-fiction writers that do the kind of writing that I do. I mean, people call it, it's just journalism, it's reporting, you people are bloggers, that kind of thing. I feel like we need structures to help us actually have more depth to our writing, because a lot of people were talking about how the non-fiction needs to sound a bit creative or needs to have depth. I understand that some of the things available on mainstream are not that rich in content. So is a question and a suggestion to begin to help non-fiction writers who do the kind of reporting, facts, and all of that, to make the writing deep, maybe the kind of workshops they do for fiction writers as well. But I need clarity also on knowing the difference between fiction and non-fiction. Thank you.
I think right now we have to call it a day because people have to go to mosque. So.
Okay, let's just answer her question though. Yeah, let's just, yeah.
Sorry. All right, guys, I think I have a solution. If you need to go to the mosque, right, please, you can leave right now. There's even a bus out there waiting to take people, so it's fine. That way, they can continue their conversation if they want to. We're not coming back until 2, so we have a bit of time. Yeah? So if you're going to the mosque, it's fine. You can go. I don't want you to feel you're waiting for it to finish. It's fine.
Yeah.
I think it works that way.
Yeah, I think, can we just give everyone a moment to
so
just
much.
exit, and then we will continue, just because I think it's quite respectful also to people who are asking questions to answer their questions. Yeah.
Yeah, but the people who want to, it's either we close it down or we let them leave. So it's this way you can talk. Those of you going to the mosque, pray for us. So. Can we take your question, so because I think you want to go, Abby?
Okay.
Hello, afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Actually, the way I see it is that sometimes we write things we don't understand ourselves. Isn't that so? Yes. I've written a lot of things that I don't understand myself. So I begin to question whether there is a yawning gap between fictionality and non-fictionality. For example, there are some historical non-fictions, historical fictions and creative non-fiction. You understand? How do you differentiate between the two? Because sometimes it's all about spontaneity, creativity and spontaneity. So it's not like poetry where it deals with form, sound, imagery, and figurative language, okay? So when you write something, you hardly can say it's fictional or non-fictional sometimes.
So historical fiction is defined as taking a historical event and then so taking fictional characters and placing them within a historical event. So that is different from creative non-fiction in a sense. It still falls under it, but it's like it's an umbrella under that. So, I mean, I don't know how to answer your question beyond going into genre specifics. So I think we can have that conversation later so that you can have the freedom to go.
Yeah,
Cool.
and he said sometimes we write things we don't understand. I just want to quickly say that I think that's why we write. We write so we can understand things that we don't understand. Yeah, so. Yeah.
Can we answer Farida's question? So I don't know if there are any platforms, but even for short fiction, it's the same thing. It's only now that it's only starting to get recognized as a form in itself. It's always a way to, if I want to just, exercise my writing muse, but it's not, I'm not writing if I'm writing short fiction. I'm writing when I'm writing a novel. So it's the same thing with creative nonfiction. People still value nonfiction more than they value creative nonfiction. But that's our task as young people on the continent. That's our task, to create those structures. We can't look out to someone else to do that for us. So let us have a conversation and figure out how we're going to create those workshops, those structures. We have technology at our play that we can use to do that. So, yeah.
Okay, so
Okay.
Yeah, he has. He's,
Okay, thank you very much.
well, let him just ask.
I'm
since we'll
asking
have
that
time.
during the conversation, I've been hearing about how well will be when we're writing from the past, how well will we be able to capture details of past events that spells the accuracy of what we're even writing at the moment. And I wanted to know what's the place of journaling? I mean, keeping a journal. What's then if we still struggle to relive memories, what's then the advantage of journaling our lives? Can't we simply just go back to those journals and then flesh out some details, or is there another way to it? Thank you.
I just want to say, you talked about lifting from our journals and all of that, and it's reminded me of something Obiang of Brittle Paper said. After Selves was published, he called us the confessional generation. I think he was right. Not everyone keeps journals, so we can't really go back to journals to fish out things to put in the gaps that we encounter when we write about our lives. So most times it's not that easy. It's not black and white. It's not like there is this huge book in the bedroom, or there are these pictures that you can always go back to fish out these things to fill in the gaps. So journaling, people who can do that are only people who keep journals can afford to do that. But for some of us who don't, we do not have that privilege.
I personally can't write. My schedule is I can't keep a journal. It wouldn't be consistent for every day to write. So it's also difficult. So I agree with you, and I agree with you. It's very difficult to do that. I'm very, very worried that we want to normalize fictionalizing things that we don't know and then still put it in the category of creative nonfiction. That for me is still a bit I don't get it.
Sorry,
Okay.
still on that.
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah. You were talking about how the process of creating creative nonfiction. Am I right? Yeah. Some events are so clear that you don't need a journal to keep them. There are so many if you read The Miseducation of Gratitude by Sibongile, it's so I don't know, the reality is so clear that you yourself would know that these things happen to someone who would never forget. So there are realities that are so glaring. Even if they happened 10 years ago, the details are there. Whenever you have the materials, you produce them as they were. Yeah.
All right, so Fakuria.
So I just wanted to, I have a few things. So first, I wanted to add to what he said about memory. I remember coming across this psychology piece that talked about how naturally as people, we cannot have, or we cannot recollect all of our memories intact. But what our mind does is it naturally reconciles. So it's sort of a coping mechanism, whether in regards to trauma or anything. It's very interesting. I'll find it and share it with you. The other thing, Frances mentioned how she writes. So I wanted to get your thoughts on this. So I write sometimes articles, and it's mostly about my experiences or other people's experiences that I have witnessed. Anything beyond that, I find it really hard to put it together. So recently, someone reached out to me to write about a story just by speaking to someone. And it's been 3 weeks, and I haven't been able to put anything together. So, and the last thing is, so I write poems. It's sort of my way of coping, right? So whenever I write a poem, when I'm done, it takes me 10 minutes. When something happens to me at that moment, and I write. And so when I go back and I read it, I feel like it just takes away the burden or the pain of that experience. So I was at a master class last year in Lagos, and I asked a question to one of the poets there about how when I write once, I never go back to edit. And I mentioned him telling me that, if you want to write something that's readable to an audience, then you need to go back and, refurbish it over and over again. And for me, it feels impossible. And I even asked, okay, but what if it feels like I'm taking out like a significant element from it, my feelings. So it feels like, it feels a bit corrupted in my, from my experience. So, and what happens is people read those poems and they tell me that they're very cryptic, right? And sometimes I don't understand, are they unreadable, or is it that, people just want me to be plain about my experiences? But to me, that would make me feel really naked in terms of my feelings, which I don't always like, doing, putting myself out there in terms of my emotions.
Can I just pose something here? You're afraid of putting yourself out there in terms of your emotions, but you're not afraid of putting your work out there. So then what is it that you want people to get from your work? I think that's where as a writer it starts, and then that will inform how you then going forward. I think for you it must be, okay, if I'm not comfortable with putting myself out there, but I want to put my work out there, what do I want people to get from it? And then that will inform.
We'll take one more question. Daisy. Daisy.
Okay, I have a list. So I'll be brief. There's something you asked a question, Ademola, about saying Afrofuturistic nonfiction. I'm like, what? Are you people becoming like prophets or something? Because how do you start pulling nonfiction from the future? That's speculation. You're simply speculating. Then, this is for Sibongile. So I want you to tell us what you had in mind. Maybe something we can explore. No, let me complete the questioning. Then, for Sibongile, you have this, you're very passionate about how nonfiction should be nonfiction. So I've read nonfiction with elements of things like magical realism in it. So you find stories that it's creative nonfiction, but it's using elements that are certainly fictional. Magical realism is not real. You get what I mean? To fill up the gaps in the story. It's using magical realism as a vehicle to tell that story. So what do you think about things like that, or should we stick to telling it as it is?
So I'm not saying tell it as it is. I'm saying be creative about how you tell it. I'm just saying don't lie while doing it. Because the minute you do, then it's no longer nonfiction. It's no longer real, right? That's what I'm saying. I'm not saying don't borrow creative elements to use, or creative structures or tools or whatever to use. I'm saying the minute you lie about an event in your piece, and that's why I'm saying it doesn't have to be your specific event. It can be someone else's event, but it must be true. It must have happened for it to fall under the bigger umbrella, which is non-fiction. Okay. That's all I'm saying.
Then, Ademola, you have two questions. This last one is for you again. You said in a balanced society, what would nonfiction writers write about? They will write about a balanced society. Like, is there something wrong with writing? Like, what experiences are valid and which ones are invalid? Is it only the sad, traumatizing experiences that are valid for nonfiction? Or I think you might get what I mean, right?
Okay, so for the second question, let's look at the context in which I asked. So we're talking about demands on non-fiction writers to always respond to issues. I'm sure in some quarters, some people expect you to have written something about you get. So I'm saying, like, if we flip it and we have a balanced system, and then maybe for some reason writers don't get this creative non-fiction writers don't get this push to record the time. So what are the what are the real stories? Let me just put it that way. What are are there stories that would interest people? Like, wouldn't everybody be writing about the same things? Although, I mean, Natalia mentioned about how more than one person can write about something. You get, but then, I mean, I'm just thinking, you know. And for the first question, I was talking about how most speculative speculative journals do not have slots for creative non-fiction writers. So I'm saying, and based on the limitations that non-fiction already has, is this like one of the limitations, or how then do creative non-fiction writers get published in a futuristic Africa? I mean, with the current shift towards Afrofuturism. That's what I'm asking.
Sorry, you know, what we call speculative non-fiction, I feel it's a bit,
Okay.
I think it's a bit wide, what we call speculative non-fiction. In Africa, what we call speculative non-fiction sometimes are real. For example, when we have Nnedi Okoro Afo's book on lagoon and mermaids and all of that, they all fall into what we call speculative non-fiction. But because, yeah, that's why I said it's wide. Speculative non-fiction is a very wide umbrella. It depends on what you call speculative non-fiction. For example, in this room right now, I can be talking about how in this room, I'm seeing people marching on this what is it called, this corridor. Depending on my imagination, depending on what I see. It's speculative, but it's real to me. So I think it depends on the experience, just like what she was saying. It has to be your experience. I may write about my dream, something that's happening in my dream. It's a dream, but it's real, but it may sound speculative to someone. Do you understand? So I think that was what he was talking about.
All right, so guys, unfortunately, we can't take any more questions. Yeah, of course, but we can have the conversations outside. So
can we give them a round of applause? So, can you take your group photo? What we would love right now, and we don't mean this rudely, is we want to clear the room so that we can kill the flies that keep disturbing